Now to introduce or reintroduce Steve Hoogerwerf to continue our presentation. Thank you, Steve.
Well, good morning. I recognize lots of you, so I hope most of you were here for the previous session. I'm only going to review what I did last week very briefly and then make some allusions to it. But we have something totally new to look at. So last week, we looked at the part of the course title, The Problem of Evil. Today's session is going to focus on the question, how is God at work in the world? And as you were here last time, I told you I never use PowerPoints when I taught at Hope College, so I sometimes forget to change the slide. Okay, so let me just review briefly. The problem of evil that we talked about last time was the dilemma that if God is good and God is all-powerful and evil exists, you can't accept all three of those claims at the same time. A good God wouldn't want evil to exist, and an all-powerful God could do something about it, but evil still exists. And my suggestion was, as many people would say, you can solve this dilemma very easily by simply eliminating one of the propositions. But if you're thinking about this from the Christian tradition, it's hard to eliminate any one of those propositions because they all seem true, right? So that's the problem. Familiar comfort phrases, and I gave you examples of lots of those last week. Phrases like everything happens for a reason usually deny the third proposition that evil exists, but without realizing that's what it's saying. For example, if everything happens for a reason, then it means people mean everything's happening for God's reasons, and it's a good God. So if a good God is doing something for a good reason, how can we call it evil? But again, if people use that phrase, they often don't think through what they're saying theologically. And in all the comfort phrases, there's usually a theological claim being made sort of beneath the surface. So we explored lots of those, and I bashed a lot of comfort phrases. And and if I bashed your favorite one, you have to figure out what to do about that. So the question, how is God at work in the world? This question is closely related to the intellectual dilemma. For example, if I knew your answer to the question, how is God at work in the world, I could probably tell you with a high degree of accuracy what you would have to say to solve the dilemma. And it's because the logic follows from saying God's at work in the world this way. For example, if you believe in an all-powerful God who controls everything that happens, you'll probably need to find a way to claim that everything is in some way good. And you would be likely then, if you believe those two things, to use one of the comfort phrases that somehow qualifies the third proposition that evil exists. You might be tempted to say something like, God allowed this bad thing to happen so that you would grow from it. Or you might say something like, God allowed this bad thing to happen because even though we can't see it now, somehow it's all part of God's marvelous master plan. Right? You have to say those kinds of things if you believe that a good God is controlling everything, right? So your answer to how is God at work in the world says something already about what you're going to need to say about the problem of evil. The question, how is God at work in the world, does open up another possible way to respond, however, rather than using comfort phrases. And that way of responding would go something like this. Perhaps God is very powerful, even powerful enough to redeem the world from evil. But perhaps God is not in total control. That's sort of the thesis statement for what's going to follow today. Perhaps God is very powerful in some way, and we'll look at a couple ways that one might claim God's very powerful, but not powerful, and that power enables God to redeem the world, but God is not in total control. Now, that is a bold claim that many people, if they haven't entertained it seriously before, have a hard time accepting. I was always taught that God's in total control of everything. And there are a lot of other beliefs that Christians have that imply that. And we'll get to how that might create a problem when we look at this a little bit later. Let's see. If God has the power to redeem the world, it's quite common for theologians to claim that God's power to redeem the world is the power of divine love. And when I mention a particular author later on, that's really his essential argument. So you'll see how the power of divine love sort of features in as an answer, like how is God at work in the world? Through the power of love. So we'll get to that. So I'm just previewing a few things that we're going to look at. God's redemptive power of love, according to the Christian tradition, and this problem is all kind of growing out of a set of Christian beliefs, right? So the power of divine love is seen from a Christian perspective in several ways. For example, Christians, I think, would say that it's often revealed in the life and teachings of Jesus, and especially in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. God's redemptive power is seen in the actions of people who throughout history have made their lives examples of this love, right? So God's power of love isn't hidden, right? But it's not the kind of power that can do everything, right? That can control everything. And that's the central claim that we'll see in the open and relational approach to this question. And we'll get to that here in just a second. I'm going to mention an author who wrote a well-known book from 40 years ago, and some of you probably know his name and his book, Rabbi Harold Kushner, and the book and the title, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Now, let me just do an aside here about the title. I just mentioned this briefly last time, but it's even more important now. His book implies the problem is when bad things happen to good people, right? Not when bad things happen to bad people. Now we might think, well, that's kind of strange, but it's really not so strange. Keep in mind, Kushner is writing out of the Jewish tradition, and there is an idea expressed in the Deuteronomic tradition that when you're good, you're blessed, and when you're evil, you're cursed, right? So when good people are blessed, that's the way it's supposed to be. When bad people are cursed, that's the way it's supposed to be because they deserve it. But things don't work out that way, do they? And so I think Kushner knows that things don't work out that way from his own life. If you read the book and remember it, you might remember that his son died of progeria, which is a rapid aging disorder. His son, I think when he was 15, his body was like the body of a very unhealthy 80-year-old. So Kushner says in his book, because he knows this from his own experience, that God does not reach down to interrupt the workings of nature to protect the righteous from harm. Right? That's the way it should be in the Deuteronomic tradition, right? God should be protecting the righteous from harm, but God doesn't do that. And so when evil happens to good or not so good people, it's not because God is punishing anyone. Like that's what Kushner concludes. Evil comes from somewhere else. It doesn't come from God. So here are some things that Kushner says that are important. Bad things happen to good people because laws of nature treat everyone alike. That's another very important claim, and we'll see that being picked up by the other authors I'm going to mention later. Nature treats everyone alike. He says a bullet has no conscience once it's fired from a gun. The same thing is true for a malignant tumor or for an automobile gone out of control. God does not reach down to interrupt the workings of nature to protect the righteous from harm. Now, Kushner goes on to illustrate this in a few other ways. Here's a couple, I think, important quotes from the book that make this point. He says, for example, insurance companies refer to natural disasters as acts of God. Now, I don't know if they still do that, but 40 years ago, that was a common phrase. He says, I don't believe an earthquake that kills thousands of innocent victims without reason is an act of God. It's an act of nature. And nature is morally blind without values. It churns along following its own laws, not caring who gets in the way. He also says, again, for him, his son's death was a central part of his problem of evil. Death is one of the given conditions of life. We can't control it or sometimes even postpone it. All we can do is try to rise beyond the question, why did it happen? And begin to ask the question, what do I do now that it has happened? So Kushner doesn't see the why does it happen question to be a worthwhile question. It's just sort of a quagmire one gets stuck in, right? And his chapter on what do we do once it happens is a really very helpful part of that book. So when Kushner said these things 40 years ago, he was, without knowing it, previewing some things that several more recent authors have suggested as an answer to how God is at work in the world. And we're going to look at some of those answers, primarily as I've learned them from three different theologians. Dennis Edwards' book, oops, did I change slides? Oh, went all the way to the end. We'll fix that in a minute. Dennis Edwards' book, How God Acts, right? How does God act in the world? And Thomas J. Ord's book, The Uncontrolling Love of God. So this suggests that the way God acts is through uncontrolling love, right? Not just love, but uncontrolling love. Oh, you're going to get me back to where I was. And then another book that's very helpful is John Polkinghorne's book, a reader by John Polkinghorne, edited by Ord. And there are two chapters in this book, one on providence and one on evil, maybe 4 pages each, which would give you a really great overview of Polkinghorne's view. I'm going to mention his name a few times as we go. Okay, let me get back to where we need to be. Okay, there we go. As I said last time, I'd probably be more comfortable if I didn't have the PowerPoint, but I know it's helpful for some people and for online people. Okay, so how is God at work in the world? Right, central question. And let's start by looking at some insights from science that suggest an answer to that. Some theologians, like the ones I'm talking about, take science and what we learn from science very seriously, and feel they must factor that truth into the answer to this question, right? And believe that what we discover in science is something about how God has created the world, right? So it's not truth apart from God. It's a truth that reveals something about God. So they take science seriously. And the insights from science, and this is an important idea in everything that follows, is that God created the kind of world in which God is by choice, by God's choice, no longer in total control of present events, neither moral evil, evil that people do, or natural evil, kind of evil that occurs as a result of nature's processes. God created this kind of world. God chose to create a kind of world that God can't control because of God's choice to create. Now, when I was young, I was taught you were never supposed to use the word God and can't in the same sentence. But here we go. Let's Okay. So we're going to come back to the question of free will a minute. I talked about that a little bit last time, the free will defense, but I'm going to apply it now to this claim that God created the kind of world that God doesn't control by God's choice. Like if God says to you, you can do anything you want, right? God suddenly has given away a lot of control. And God says, because I love the people I've created the way I've created them, I'm not going to take your freedom away from you, which takes away, by God's choice, a lot of God's control. So in the free will defense, which is a theodicy we looked at last time, but briefly, the free will defense defends God against the claim that God is responsible for evil by saying that evil isn't caused by God. It's caused by human choices and the actions that result from human choices. And those choices are possible because God gave us capacity and the freedom to make those choices. So free will is built into creation the way God chose to create, as the argument goes. And now it operates on its own in each one of us every day and in everybody else in the world. So the free will response resolves the problem of evil by qualifying the proposition that God is in total control. Right? God may be powerful, but not all powerful. All powerful would mean total control. God is not in total control. And that capacity we have to make choices sometimes results in evil choices. And when evil happens as a result of human choices, it makes sense to say, don't blame God for that. God didn't do that. People did that. So the free will response clearly addresses the question, how is God at work in the world? Not by saying exactly how God works, but by saying something really important about how God is not at work in the world. Because free will, and this I think is an important phrase too, carves out a space in creation where human causation and not divine causation is at work. Again, this space isn't carved out by us. It's carved out by God in the way God chose to create human beings. But once that creation is done, then there's a space where God's sort of chosen not to be in total control. We'll get to natural evil in just a minute. I just want to say a couple more things about this. If freedom is real, like not just sometimes people imply that like we're a puppet, and as a puppet, we feel like we're making free choices. We don't realize, right, that all the strings are attached and the puppeteer is really doing it all for us. But if freedom is real, right, and we're not puppets, then there's a wide range of evil and suffering that God cannot be held responsible for. God is not at work in the world in those ways. Things like injustice or oppression or war or racism or environmental degradation or the whole range of ways people abuse each other. Like that's a big swath of evil, isn't it? And it's resulting from God's choice to give us freedom, and then to give up control over what we do with our freedom. So the free will response says that God is not in total control when it comes to moral evil. That's a distinction we made last week, moral evil, natural evil, because moral evil is caused by people's by people's immoral choices. And if we say that about free will now, we've already made an important revision in the intellectual dilemma. Now the dilemma is no longer a dilemma, but it would go like this. God is good, God is powerful, but because God chose to give humans free will, God is not in total control, and so evil exists, right? Because sometimes humans use their free will to do evil. No longer a dilemma. Now we understand why there's evil, right? Because people have free choice. Even though God's good, right? God sort of can't do anything about it. I want to point out that I've given a talk something like this before where some psychologists were in the audience, and I felt compelled to say this. Free will does not require us to assert absolute freedom. Like, we don't have absolute freedom. For example, humans create history, and humans create culture, and history and culture influences some of the decisions we make, right? In a way, we're kind of captured by our cultural conditioning, right? But culture was still made by humans, right? And culture now is remaking humans sort of in its own image, right? So it's not absolute freedom, but it's still the result of human choices and human actions and human culture building and human history. And the free will response, again, I want to emphasize, only applies to moral evil. So it might solve half of the problem, but there's another problem yet to be solved. And we'll get to that when we look at natural evil and an open and relational understanding of God and the world. So this heading suggests the main outline of much of what's to come. Open and relational. What do we mean by an open view of how God is at work in the world? So we'll talk about that for a little bit. And what do we mean by God being at work in the world in a relational way? So, previewing what's to come. First of all, the classical problem of evil, again, that God is almighty. God's typically understood as being in total control, or perhaps standing by when God could be in control. I don't think God's active or passive choices make much of a difference. Like, God didn't cause it, right? God just stood there and didn't do anything about it. But that's a serious problem too. I'll mention something about that in a bit. So if God is in total control, then God's responsible for everything that happens. And sometimes people believe that covers the range of like huge events and all the sort of microscopic things that are going on that we don't even know, right? We can't even see, right? All the minute details. So if God has that kind of control, God's responsible for everything that happens, both good and evil. And in the case of natural evil, however, we have another problem to solve. And that's what this open and relational approach is going to try to solve. So what if God's not in total control? What might that look like? Well, in the light of modern scientific understandings of the world, it's been suggested that we understand the natural world as open. It wouldn't be open if God was controlling it all, right? But since God's not controlling it all, it's open. And God's interaction with the world then is relational, rather than controlling. And that makes sense to us, I think, even on a human level. I can have a relationship with you, right, that might be meaningful, maybe influential or like mutually influential, and that we might describe as a friendship. But friends don't, hopefully, try to control each other, right? They relate to each other. And so that's a kind of analogy to what's going to be meant by a relational approach. So an open and relational approach fully acknowledges what we learn from science about how the world works. Now, what we learn from science, I guess you have to sort of fill in what that means. You all have some knowledge about what you've learned from science, right? And so there's some things we've learned from science that make us realize that a lot of things just happen naturally, like this. What's going to happen? You know, based on science, right? Gravity. And if you're standing too close to the edge of a mountain and you fall off, you know what's going to happen. Gravity. We also would know something about what happens to soft objects that strike hard objects. Right? So we know a lot from science about how the world works. So the world in some ways is predictable. But the future is still open because, for example, I might have decided just to say, you know what's going to happen, don't you? And then set the paper down again, right? But instead I dropped it. The future is open because of free will, and the process is built in to nature. Free will, for example, the future is open because you might have two things you're thinking of doing after this class is over, right? You're going to choose one of them. Once you choose that one, there's a kind of trajectory of consequences that will occur, right? And what would have happened if you'd chosen the other one, those things won't occur. And until you make the choice, there's no way to know what's going to happen, right? So free will makes the human future open. It's also open because God has built a kind of openness into the natural world. Due to free will, we can't know with any certainty what a choice a person will make, but it's also true that we don't necessarily know, even if we understand science, what will happen. I think meteorology is a good example of this. Meteorologists know a lot about how the weather works, and they know a lot about what conditions create what kind of weather. But they don't seem to know with any certainty, for example, what the weather is going to be like next month or next year, or maybe even at the end of the 8-day forecast, right? There's an openness in the way the processes work. And although one might be able to make a good guess based on what one knows, you can't know the open future, even in nature, with any kind of certainty. So creation is an act of limitation on the part of God, right? The creation of human will is an act of self-limitation, but the creation of an open natural world is also the result of the way God chose to create the natural world. This open view is often called non-interventionist. Is that on the slide? Yes. Non-interventionist is an important word that the authors that I've talked about when I showed you the books, they all view a non-interventionist God. God creates the world in such a way that God doesn't need to be constantly intervening. Events in the world are not the direct result of God's constant intervention. However, when we discover these things in science, as Francis Collins talks about in his books on this topic, we do discover in the wondrous things we see a kind of witnessing the complexity and wonder and greatness of God. So science doesn't leave God out, but the way God creates the world that science discovers shows that God's, in a sense, chosen to be left out of the way things work. Okay, Dennis Edwards, the book How God Acts, Creation, Redemption, and Special Divine Action. A lot of good points in this book. You can see from all my sticky notes and my underlinings, if you can see those. So I'm just going to give you a very brief summary of a book. And probably anytime someone gives you a summary of a book that's so brief, it's not exactly accurate because it has to leave out some important qualifications and explanations, right? So I just want to acknowledge this is going to be a very brief summary of what is a somewhat complex argument, but I hope I'm simplifying it in a way that tells you what Edwards is saying. So 4 points that Edwards is making here. So God created a world of complex and connected relationships in which the natural processes that God created have their own integrity. That again is a very important claim. They have their own integrity. In creation, God enabled the world to run by itself on the basis of its own laws. So there's no need for outside intervention. And Edwards explicitly argues for a non-interventionist approach, which I think reflects the world as many of us see it. Like we don't, I'm guessing a lot of us don't think that God is controlling every action of every one of us all the time, or of the billions of people in the world, or of the billions upon billions of things that are going on in nature, right? We don't think it's necessary to see God sort of making active decisions about all of that. And if natural processes have their own integrity, then God respects creation. God respects the integrity of creation and doesn't need to constantly break in and sort of change things. And in terms of the problem of evil, this means that God is not causing evil, nor is God scripting the events that cause people to suffer. Like everything happens for a reason implies that God is scripting the events, right? For some reason God has in mind, and things have to kind of just work out a certain way, the way God sort of plans it to work out. But Edwards' open position and non-interventionist position says, no, that's not the way it works. So if that's not the way it works, how does God act? Is there still room for God to be active in the world? And Edwards still wants to see a way for God to be active. Ord still wants there to be a way to be active. Polkinghorne still wants there to be a way to be active. And so I'm going to summarize what Edwards says about that and sort of just have us think about that for a minute. So the phrase that Edwards continuously uses in this section of the book is that God acts in and through creaturely processes. God isn't causing what happens, but God is in some way acting in and through creaturely processes. But Edwards says we can't know exactly how this working in and through actually happens. It's sort of a mystery in the background. And this view does not tell us how God acts in and through them. In fact, God is incomprehensible, Edwards says, so a theology of divine action shouldn't spell out how God acts, because how could we know? And we should insist in a theology of divine action that we cannot know how God is acting in and through creaturely processes. So you can decide if that works for you. You probably have to read what he says about that to decide if it really works for you. I'm not sure it really works all that well for me, but I think I know what Edwards is trying to do here. And you'll probably have some sympathy with what he's trying to do here. I think he wants to honor the way the world works on its own, like the way that's revealed by science. But he also doesn't want to totally leave God out. He doesn't want science to be the whole story. So God's acting in and through, right, in addition. So that's why he holds on to this sort of mysterious assumption about what's going on in a way that we can't see. God's working in and through the natural processes. So that makes it easier with this open view to see how God's not the cause of evil, but it does make it more difficult for us to see how there's actually room for God to act, right? Unless you posit a God acting in and through. So Edwards, I think, would like to see a space for God to act, but it remains difficult to see where this space for God actually, to see how it actually fits into a non-interventionist view, because it would imply, like, I'm saying God's not intervening, but wait, God's intervening sort of in a way, like when he's acting in and through, like, can you have it both ways? I think a lot of Christians would like to see some things happening as God having a hand in it. A lot of students, when I was teaching, used to describe something as like a God thing. I think that's a worldview. They don't know exactly how it's a God thing. Couldn't explain it. But they say it because Christians have often been taught to see things this way. And if we accept an open and not an interventionist view, there's really no way to know that, like, this is a God thing. Because we can't know how divine intervention was involved, or we can't know even that divine intervention was involved. But with a worldview, right, where you can sort of choose when to see God involved in things, like, because some things apparently aren't God things, right? You would never say that about horrible events that happen. Like, so there's a kind of Christian worldview that sees God's hand in things when one can't really know how God was involved or whether God was involved. And again, I think Edwards was probably influenced by this, and that's why he wants to find some space for God to still be acting. Thomas Ord. I wasn't sure when I put the PowerPoint together that I was going to include what he has to say. So no outline, but I'm just going to make two simple points from Ord's long, complex argument. So the 2 points are these. I'm going to say just a couple of things about what I think he means by saying the future is open, which might help you understand that concept maybe a little better than you do yet. And a few things about what he understands as the relational dimension to God's being at work in the world. So the future is open. So here's one way to think about that. The future is not yet set because it has not yet been determined. It hasn't been determined by God, hasn't been determined by the natural processes that are going on. It hasn't been determined yet by the choices you're going to make when you leave this room or for the rest of your life. Right? So the future is not yet set, which would imply, or implies, God doesn't see the future because the future is not there to be seen. Right? God sees it unfolding. In fact, the way God created the world, the future is in a process of constantly becoming, right? Like today became what it is now but tomorrow hasn't happened yet, right? So tomorrow is still in the process of becoming. And we're co-creators in that becoming, right? Because God created the kind of world in which we can determine to a considerable extent what tomorrow looks like. So this means, and he quotes Polkinghorne here, that even God does not yet know the unformed future, for the future is not yet there to be seen or known. Okay. So again, you can see why this is a kind of non-interventionist view, right? Because nature and human choices are making the future. God's not making the future. But there is still a relational dimension, and this comes out clearly in Ord's explanation of what he calls uncontrolling love, and that's even in the title of his book, The Uncontrolling Love of God. So this divine love is the reason God created human creatures. Like God created human creatures out of love. And the Christian tradition would say that God continues to love the creatures God created. God created the natural world, right? And God continues to love the natural world. And this divine love seeks shalom. I think the best translation of the word shalom is human well-being. Right? God seeks human well-being, and God desires to redeem all of creation, right? Because of God's love. But love is a limited kind of power. There are some things that uncontrolling love cannot do. And you know this in your own life. If you have children, for example, who you love, right? Love doesn't control them, right? Love sometimes has to forgive them because you can't control them, right? So marriage relationships, friendships, you love people, but love doesn't enable you to control them. It might enable you to persuade or encourage, right, but not control. So uncontrolling love, a very limited kind of power. It can't prevent all harm that creatures do to each other, and it can't prevent the random acts of nature that sometimes cause horrendous events, like earthquakes or hurricanes, or like what we call natural disasters. But Ord claims, excuse me, let me get a drink here a second. He claims that empowering love does make something important possible: human agency. God's love can have strong, inspiring, persuasive power. And he says when humans respond well to God's love, which they need to choose to do, right? Because they can choose not to. But when they choose to respond well to God's love, he has this nice phrase that incorporates part of the Lord's Prayer. Then the result is that God's will is done on earth as it is in heaven. But God can't make it happen that way. People have to choose it. But God's love can push them in that direction, encourage them in that direction, right? And so divine love is very powerful, but it doesn't control things. Okay, so that's Ord's piece, which I think you can see is consistent so far. What Kushner said in brief, and what Edwards argued, and what Ord argues, it's all pretty consistent, right? It gets more complex as the years go on, but I think they're all saying virtually the same sort of thing, which is probably still not standard Christian theology, and certainly not among lay people. If you went to an average church in Holland of any denomination, Catholic or Protestant, I don't think you'd find most people saying God's not in total control. So this is sort of a novel way of thinking about it that I'm proposing, because I think it does make some sense, although I'm going to acknowledge that it creates some theological problems as well. So, summary so far. How does this view of how God is at work in the world shape a way of looking at the problem of evil? Well, I think it does so by revising how we understand the proposition that God's all powerful. Right? It doesn't do what comfort phrases do by revising evil exists. It revises God as all powerful. So now the dilemma, which is no longer a dilemma, God's good, God's not in total control, evil exists. We can even state it causally. God's good, but God's not in total control, so evil exists. If God was in total control, a good God was in total control, evil wouldn't exist. So again, we've solved the dilemma, but we haven't sort of solved the whole problem. Oh, there's something here I want to point out something. A God who's not in total control. So a non-interventionist view says that God doesn't cause evil, and also that God doesn't step in and interfere with nature. But if that's the case, and God can't control everything, then we might have a problem. And the problem might be that God is seen as a guilty bystander. So, if God's not in total control and God's not intervening, this then means, right, that God isn't responsible for evil. But let's think about an analogy. Let's say I see evil happening and I can do something about it. So I do. And I'm a hero, right? I stop evil from happening. But if I see evil from happening and I don't do anything about it, right, then I'm probably seen as unkind, uncaring, maybe myself evil, right? An enabler of evil. And so I'm what's sometimes called the guilty bystander. I just stood by and watched evil happen when I could have done something about it. And the idea that God doesn't cause the evil, but stands by, right, and doesn't act, can make God appear, again, like a guilty bystander. So, but again, if God chose to create a kind of world where God sort of can't intervene, then it sort of gets rid of the idea that God's a guilty bystander. Okay, so guilty bystander is one potential problem as you think about this approach, but there are some other problems. I'm just going to name them because each of the problems I'm going to name probably could take another session to unpack. For example, what about prayer? If God's not in control, and I pray an intercessory prayer, asking God to do something or to help somebody or to heal somebody, this approach would sort of imply that God would say, sorry, can't do that. I've created the kind of world in which I don't intervene in those kinds of things, right? So this approach creates some serious problems for intercessory prayer, which is in some ways central to the way a lot of Christians think about God. And the New Testament, right, and the Old Testament sort of present a picture of intercessory prayer where God can choose to do what people ask God to do, right? And even encouraged to pray because God will do what you ask God to do. So each author deals a little bit with that, but again, it's kind of a complex question and it's hard to resolve. Right, so I just want to, right, so if you like this idea of a non-interventionist God, then you have to probably do something about your understanding of prayer. Or how about miracles? Like miracles imply that God sort of intervenes in a really amazing way, right? Usually in the natural world, if we consider human disease and parting the Red Sea and all that, right? God intervenes in really miraculous ways, implies that God has a lot of power. right? But again, miracles sort of cause the problem of evil too, right? If God could do a miracle, if God, I have a relative who has pancreatic cancer and maybe 6 months to live. If God could do a miracle, then God could heal him. If God doesn't do a miracle, then could God choose to let him die? Like, why would a good God who could heal him not heal him? Right? So miracles are a problem with a non-interventionist view. But even if you have a regular sort of standard Christian view of things, miracles still do cause the problem of evil in a way. And the whole idea of divine providence. The doctrine of providence means from the word God provides for us. God takes care of us. And so the traditional doctrine of providence, and there are also, that's a topic addressed. One of Polkinghorne's chapters is titled Providence. Like, how do we understand providence in an open world and a non-interventionist world? So probably not easily in the way that you might understand it now. There's also the potential problem of a clockmaker God, right? The clockmaker God idea is God created a marvelous clock, this creation, and it now it works on its own, right? A good clock works on its own. Hopefully, it doesn't need to be constantly repaired by the clockmaker. So the clockmaker God, that kind of makes sense in a way, except it implies a kind of inactive God, a God that kind of creates the world and then steps away from it. Now, the relational understanding will address that, but some of what I've said sort of implies a clockmaker God, which might seem like a problem to you. And it also makes one wonder, well, if God doesn't intervene, God can't intervene, what good's God? And Krishna, I think it's his last chapter, Krishna's last chapter is the question, what good then is religion? And he has an answer, right? Here's some ways religion is good. Okay, so in the last few minutes here, I want to outline the non-interventionist view as a relational view. Think of this. I find this little either or option kind of helpful way to think about things. So we either have an active God in a responsive universe or a responsive God in an active universe. An active God in a responsive universe is sort of like a God with total power. God acts and the universe has to respond to what God does. But what if we think about it this second way? The universe acts and God responds. In a relational approach, the universe acts, things happen, and God responds, right, in caring, creative ways. And so let me just give you a couple examples of what that might look like. Sort of based on things claimed in Christian theology. First, that there is a crucified God. God enters into the world as suffering, right? So God responds, right, in active, redemptive ways. God's not just an observer. God is a compassionate observer, right, who chooses to suffer with people who suffer. People subjectively experience God's love, right, and that makes a difference in their lives. Jesus' teachings remain a present, powerful, positive force for good in a world where evil exists. Jesus called forth a church, right? Ecclesia, called people out of the world into a community. And that community, when people are part of it, often provides care and comfort and intervention, right, that makes a difference in people's lives. And Christians often experience God's love as a source of hope. So there are an option to comfort phrases are what I call practical theodicies. Polkinghorne says this: the ethical imperative to care for others would become meaningless if God could always be relied on for miraculous interventions to save people from bad consequences. But God doesn't always do that. So there is an ethical imperative to care for others. This is a practical theology or a practical theodicy, and it's an alternative to comfort phrases like the ones we looked at last week. Comfort phrases always contain sort of hidden theological claims that are supposed to resolve the intellectual dilemma, but resolving the intellectual dilemma does nothing about the real world. I mean, let's say that last night I solved the intellectual dilemma and I put my solution on the internet and it's gone viral. Retired Hope College professor solves the problem of evil. What would be different in the world today? Not much. Like all of the things that cause us to struggle with the problem of evil would still be going on. Solving the intellectual dilemma doesn't change the real world. So practical theodicies are alternatives to solving the intellectual dilemma. Let me give you just sort of three closing quotes that I think get at the importance of practical theodicies. And we could have if there was another session, that next session would probably be on let's look at some practical ways of addressing evil, right, rather than trying to solve the dilemma. So Nicholas Berdyaev, who was a Russian philosopher and theologian, Christian theologian, says, the paradox of suffering and evil is resolved in the experience of compassion and love. This would be one of my favorite quotes, especially about the problem of evil. The paradox, right, the intellectual dilemma, isn't solved by logic or explanations. It's solved by the experience of compassion and love. And if you've ever gone through suffering, I imagine that what helped you through it was the compassion and love of other people. Like it didn't solve the like why me or why is this happening or why would good God let this happen. But compassion and love sort of solved your suffering. Dorothy Zola said something similar. She said, suffering's not a problem that can be solved by thought, because to do that would be like trying to walk to some place that you couldn't get to by foot. Instead, she says, what's important is to care about people through social, cultural, political, economic causes, by looking at those causes and by addressing the social, cultural, political, and economic problems that cause people suffering. And she sees medicine as a good example of this. Medicine is holistic. It includes comfort care, but also surgical, medicinal, lifestyle interventions, and it's based on scientific investigation. So it's holistic in that way. So for her, medicine is a really good example. And finally, a quote that you probably all know from Teresa of Avila. How do we stand with God in active resistance in a world where God is not any longer in total control? She says, Christ has no body now on earth but yours. No hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes through which Christ's compassion looks out to the world. Yours are the feet with which Christ walks to do good. Yours are the hands with which God blesses the world. Right? So God doesn't intervene with God's hands and feet, but God enables us and inspires us, one might say, through uncontrolling love to sort of be the presence of God or Christ or good in the world. So that's all I have for today. And now we have about a half hour for questions or comments or disagreements or corrections or whatever. And sort of conversation between you is fine too. You don't have to just all address questions to me. Last time I learned a lot from your comments. So raise your hand. You have to speak in a microphone, otherwise some of us won't hear you and the people online won't hear you. So Bev, you have a comment?
Yeah, I have a friend who lost two sons in separate, very tragic circumstances. She just cannot believe in God. So how does that fit into this whole equation?
And my guess is she can't believe in God because she thinks God could have done something about it and didn't. Do you think that's,
Right, or prevented it in the first place?
Yeah.
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 Mhm.
so, so given her beliefs, it makes sense that she wouldn't believe in God. Like, why would you believe in a God who could have prevented your son's death and didn't? So she probably has to change her theology first, right? To see that.
I don't know if she was, I doubt that she was a strong Christian in the first place.
Okay.
So there's that whole reinforcement that, well, why even bother to believe?
Well, I think, did I say last time that there are two leading reasons that people give who aren't Christians for not becoming Christians? One is the problem of evil. Like, why would I become a Christian, right, when there's this problem? And the second is Christians are all a bunch of hypocrites, which hopefully isn't true, but it's such a common perception. It's the second main reason outsiders don't choose to become Christians. So last time I talked about my mother's death at age 45 when I was in high school and freshman in college, and how that sort of turned my faith upside down for a long time. So it makes good sense to me that a serious tragedy could sort of mess up one's faith in some way, or make it difficult to come to faith.
Can I also thank you for presenting a very difficult subject, very easily understood. We could understand what you were saying and gave us some very provocative things to think about.
Thank you, Beth. Anyone else? Oh, we only have one mic today, so Kathy's going to have to do some running around.
I'm curious, how is providence defined exactly? What is providence?
I think the simplest way to define it is providence is the doctrine that God actively cares for the world that God created. So you can depend on God, you can trust God. Does that help? I mean, in John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, when he's talking about providence, he has this example. If you're walking through the street of wherever he was, whatever town he named at the time, Switzerland, I think, maybe it was in Geneva, and a tile comes loose and falls off the roof and hits you on the head as you're walking by, or doesn't. Right? God's providence is at work there. So providence would allow someone to, jump away and say, "Wow, that was close. Like, God saved me." Or we hear this when people, like car accidents, right? And someone's not injured, and I'm thankful that God saved me. So that's an example of people seeing providence at work, God providing for or taking care of the world God created. Providence would say there are no chances. God was at work. And what others might see as chance happenings. Hold on.
I think I may be able to clarify what you're saying.
Okay.
Let's talk Milton, the end of Paradise Lost. Some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. The world was all before them where to choose their place of rest, and providence their guide. That's not the end of the sentence, but my point is, okay, there are two meanings here. One is providence can be their guide being a simplified definition of that concept. But the lines also suggest that they have the choice, the free will, to decide whether or not providence will be their guide.
Oh, okay. Well, in terms of providence being a guide, the free choice thing makes sense. Like there are other views of providence that are a bit more deterministic, right? So
And as you were talking, I wondered also about how predestination figures in, especially since you said God doesn't know the future.
yep, I don't, these authors wouldn't figure in predestination at all. Right? So, and predestinations, I mean, there's a lot of sort of theological conflict about predestination, or especially double predestination. So it's really, yeah, I mean, we'd need probably a whole course, like a whole college course to look carefully at predestination. Well, I was taught in seminary that it was legitimate to consider the view, this is Western seminary, to consider predestination to be highly problematic and not something one necessarily needed to affirm.
I have a comment from online. Thank you. And Christian faith would have been much easier and powerful for me all my life if I had experienced your thoughts and voice when I was very young.
Well,
Thank you for these last 2 weeks, because it's been really good for me to hear all this. But the one phrase that I'm focusing on is when you said, God is incomprehensible.
Mm.
And that kind of stops all discussion, all debate, all questioning in some ways. You know, God is incomprehensible. We don't know.
I took students on a May-term course 10 times over 12 years to the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. That reservation is the third poorest place in the United States, depending on which census. Sometimes there's first or second or third. Out of all the counties in the United States, there's 2,000 some counties. So it's poverty like you would only see in third world countries, right in the heart of the US. So I learned something really interesting about Lakota, the Sioux Indians. That's the Americans' name, the white people's name for them. They call themselves the Lakota. They had a very interesting view of God. One of the words they used for God was Tunkashala, which is the word grandfather, right? Which is sort of like a lot of Christians, like God's an old man with gray hair sitting on a throne somewhere, right? Who loves you, hopefully like your loving grandfather did. But they also have another word, Wakantanka, which is another name for God, which means the great mysterious, right? And so it's interesting that God can be grandfather, but also the great mysterious, so incomprehensible. And I think there's a lot of things about God that I must acknowledge are incomprehensible.
So related to that, I just kept thinking of Job because all his friends gave all the phrases we learned last week
yeah.
that just are not right. And God in the end says, who are you to question and ask? Another question I had is, is it comforting? Is it to think of infinity? Like, to me, just this is just a pinprick. Life is just a pinprick, and don't think of it as everything. Compared to infinity. You like when we're having a baby, you can get through this and it'll end up okay.
Yeah, I'm sure many people find that very comforting, right? Is that this is sort of the passing humanity, right, will turn into God's paradise, right? And so you just have to be patient to wait.
Just like last week, things that you've talked about have started all of these different thoughts going through my mind. So I hope I'm going to be coherent. One of them is that I think I think I mentioned this last week, that I've been interested in faith and religion since I was an infant, because I believe God was with me when I was in the hospital. But one of the things in studying religion as much as I have, which is limited, but is that every religion has tried to put a face on God or faith. But they had to do that using their limited cultural understanding. And then moving forward in time, trying to keep from letting people discover on their own, wanting to prescribe what you needed to believe about God, what you needed to believe about miracles, whatever. And I think that thinking of God is as the unknowable, as the something we can't understand as human beings, is sort of the best understanding of faith for me. Is believing that there's something beyond me, beyond us, that is ununderstandable, but they're like a good therapist to learn from, to grow.
And that's partly why I like the Lakota way of thinking, right? God is the great mysterious, but not only that, right? God's also, there's also a way of knowing God more like a grandfather. So I kind of like the duality there.
Could you comment a little bit more about the importance and place of prayer in our daily lives when they seem to go against the laws that God already has put in place?
Oh, you're right. So if there are laws God's put in place and we ask God to change those laws because of our interest, like I love this person who's dying. Yeah, what am I doing? I'm presuming that God might sometimes change those laws. And that then often not, right? Because most Christians who are dying of cancer are being prayed for and they die anyway, right? So God doesn't always change the laws. But it presumes that God might choose to do that in special cases. And that's sort of problematic. Like, why would God do that for my relative, but not for somebody else's relative? So is someone else want to? So yeah, so I think I tend, because there's something about this non-interventionist thing that appeals to me. I find prayers of gratitude very important because they don't conflict with any of this. But intercessory prayers, that's become difficult for me ever since my mother died, right? So most of my life I've struggled with intercessory prayer.
I think the whole idea of what laws, what rules God has put in place is fascinating, because I don't believe that any of those rules that we say are God-given are God-given. They are what a human being has tried to put meaning to, and therefore, the word I want here is not coming, but therefore anything that a man does is influenced by their culture, by their bias, by what they see. I don't think any human being can know what God's rules are, even though every religion presumes that they do.
I think the earlier comment might have been applying to the laws, like laws of nature, right? Which you discover, right? And religious laws that Christians are taught, right? Ways to be good, are humanly created laws that humans believe reflect somehow God. But to say this is what God wants, like, how do I know that, right? I think your comment earlier reminded me too. I think there's a common way that people talk about religion versus spirituality. Have you noticed that? Religion is bad and spirituality is good. I think that's because people often fill the term religion with everything negative, and they fill the term spirituality with everything good. And one of the negatives is being told, right, what you should do, what you should think. And if people who would rather not be told by religion, then go to spirituality where they're sort of leaving that part out. I think you could also say it's all religion, right? Some parts of religion are good, other parts of religion are good, but people have often divided that now using those two terms. It's kind of, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to kind of say what you say. I've never tagged myself or put that word on myself that I'm a non-interventionist, but I don't believe in prayer. I don't pray because I don't believe that that can happen, that someone's life might be spared because they're going to be granted special treatment. I might ask for grace and strength. But yeah, I guess I don't believe that that would work. At the same time, I struggle with this idea of the mysterious God. I think in my daily life, I entertain that, but I struggle with the concept that if I come from God and if God is within all of us, if there is a purpose to this life, is that not my purpose, but to know and understand that mystery?
I mean, that's very helpful comment. I'm just going to let that stand on its own. You also used a phrase last week, that God doesn't micromanage everything, right? And that I knew when you said that, I thought, oh, I'm going to use that phrase next week.
These days, I think some people who are learning about the Christian religion for the first time are puzzled by the idea that we have a triune God and that's some big thing. Why would it be such a big thing that we had to think of God in the three different ways of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost? And all the ink that was spilled on trying to develop the triune God and what it meant to when that idea first became a creed, are a little bit lost on it, but they're an effort to deal with the unknowability of God and yet the caring grandfather image, the gap between the two things that you're pointing to, that culture that you're studying there is struggling toward the same thing, to deal with the almighty mystery, Father beyond our knowing, but a Father beyond our knowing. And then we had to get rid of Father to include Mother. So the idea of God keeps changing with the culture as we go through the ages. Even in Christianity, there's really, it's hard to say the Christian faith teaches, because what they teach in different centuries begins to answer the questions that century is most deeply asking. And then the picture of God does change. Two things that, I mean, if Jesus can kneel in Gethsemane and say, let this cup pass from me, but if it can't, then thy will be done. First of all, who heard that prayer to know that? And secondly, that is very human. And if Jesus cannot change the will of God, then why do you think that your intercessory prayer might change something? My husband was the hospital chaplain, so the hospital chaplains deal with death on a daily basis and people praying about the death of their. And so he taught his chaplains to be more mature in their, and help people cross that bridge of understanding what is and is not a prayer in the presence of death with the people who are suffering that last period. There is no one answer, but I think it's correct that intercessory prayer may have a function. But if I'm late to this class and I need a parking place and I suddenly say, God, please give me a parking place. I've got to park right now. And then you find a parking place. That was not proper intercessory prayer, and you were just darn lucky, and that's all there is to it.
But I've heard Christians with a different way of seeing say, God gave me this parking place, right? So,
That's right.
yeah.
That's right. But we can't dismiss the possibility that the Spirit of God uses chance from time to time. But of course, that's what all gamblers are depending on.
A comment from online. It seems we are leaving out the core underpinning of the Christian faith, which is the cause of suffering and evil in the world is the fall of man, i.e. original sin. We live in a sin fallen world that we see suffering, evil, man's inhumanity to man, etc. But none of this originates from God, but the evil one. And God made a way to save us from this incurable problem through the death and resurrection of Jesus. Salvation doesn't eliminate suffering, but gives us perspective and acceptance of the temporal nature of this world versus eternity.
So that comment coincides with what I've been saying about original sin, free will. Like free will creates the opportunity for sinful behavior, which causes much of the evil we see. One could go further to say, what's the cause of sin, right? Is free will the cause of sin, or is Satan the cause of sin, or whatever else, right? So, but the free will argument at least does acknowledge that sin is a huge part of how we account for the evil we see.
Okay, couple comments, see if I can remember. I don't usually do this much talking, it's interesting. But one of the things I say sometimes is, if there's somebody to thank, who am I going to thank? I have to thank God. You know, so often I do find that parking space. Thank you, God, because I want to thank somebody. I can't thank the person who left that parking space for me because they're gone. So I often do during my day, I do say, thank you, God. The other thing is, I was going to say, when I do pray, because that's another thing I say sometimes, I can't not pray. You know, and so, but when I pray for people that I'm concerned about, I just go through the list of names. And if it's somebody that I'm really concerned about, I say their name twice. And there's a few people on my list whose name I say twice. But yeah, I don't, again, incomprehensible. How do I know? But I can't not do it. So, yeah.
It seems to me living a life full of gratitude is a much better way to live life than a life that is almost devoid of gratitude. So, and for the phrase in prayer, thy will be done, I think often is a way that people are leaving space for the possibility that prayer won't really be answered, or will be answered with a no. But again, it still presumes that God's in control of answering it or not answering. Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, it looks like there are. So thank you for being a wonderful audience.